Welcome to Crossing Barriers, Building Friendships, a podcast of Peace Lutheran Church from Spring Hill, Tennessee. We're delighted that you're here today. Our guest today is the Reverend Stacy Rector. She is the Director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you, Ann. Good to be here.
So I went to the state of Tennessee website and just got some brief numbers. And Tennessee became a state in 1796, but yet the first execution did not begin until 1916. And then it seems like there's this big gap from 1960 to about 2000. So can you kind of explain a little bit the history of state executions in Tennessee?
I can do my best. Tennessee has always been fairly ambivalent, if you will, on the death penalty. It's not been a state that's utilized it very much. Very early in our statehood, my understanding is we eliminated it as a mandatory sentence. At one time, death was a mandatory sentence for certain crimes, and we eliminated it, and that was way early on in our statehood. Then in the 60s, the state moved toward ending it altogether, and only by one vote was it maintained in the legislature. And the governor at the time, Governor Clement, actually commuted all the death sentences after that happened. And then again, as you said, we went from 1960 to 2000 through both Democratic and Republican governors with 0 executions. We were the last former state of the Confederacy to resume executing. And we did that in 2000. I think part of that, no one exactly knows what was going on there, but I think part of it was in the 90s, as you all may recall, there was this very, tough on crime, lock them up, throw away the key, super predators are everywhere kind of mentality. And a lot of politicians rode that wave. And Governor Sundquist, my understanding is, sort of put the death penalty back on the agenda during his as he was looking to become governor, that he would make sure we started executing again. That's my understanding. If I'm incorrect about that, somebody can call in to you, Ann, and correct me, or call me, it doesn't matter. But that is my understanding, that there was generally that sort of mentality out there, and politicians were using that as a part of their platform. And so when Governor Sundquist was elected, he pushed to get it going again. And that's kind of what happened. And so in 2000, we executed a man. And then from 2000 to 2009, we executed 6 people. Then there was another pretty big gap because of lethal injection litigation, because of just how problematic the lethal injection protocol is and was and is and continues to be, even though that litigation, the courts, quote unquote, settled it. Nothing's really been settled other than they're okay with using a cocktail that potentially causes awful and excruciating suffering if there's not an alternative, basically, is what the court landed on. So once that got decided in I believe that was 2018, there was nothing holding back the state from pursuing more dates. And so that's what happened. And so from 2018 to now, we executed 7 more people. So we're now up to 13 executions in the modern era, which is still quite low compared to some of our neighbors. But it's obviously 13 more people than I think we should have executed. The concern I have, Ann, is even as Tennessee and the rest of the country are are moving away from the death penalty in the sense that we are not sentencing very many people to death at all anymore. We've only had 3 new death sentences in our state since 2013. Around the country, death sentences have plummeted. As people are learning more about the problems, as they're less trustful of the system, and as alternative sentences are more available, the public is just not as interested in the death penalty. But unfortunately, Tennessee has 40 some odd people on death row who were mostly sentenced in the 80s and 90s. People who likely today would not get a death sentence. Mm-hmm. And we're now executing people from another era. And so we have a lot of people who are at the end of their appeals because of that. And so it's very possible Tennessee could, we've got 2 executions set this year. It's possible we could end up with 3 or 4 more, and that would just continue on. So it's this strange place we're in where I think people are actually moving away from the death penalty, and juries are moving away from the death penalty. And yet we've got this backlog of individuals from a different time, under different rules, who were sitting there 30 years later facing death.
So a couple of comments. One is that as a Lutheran pastor, Governor Sundquist was a Lutheran too, and it makes me really sad to hear that he was the one that kind of put the death penalty back on the table. The church where I did my internship when he was in Nashville, he would go there to worship. So several of the people that I worshiped with remember giving Governor Sundquist communion.
I could be wrong about that, Anne, because that was prior to my moving back here. But that's so I don't want to put something on the Governor Sundquist that's not legitimately his. But my understanding is that I know his administration is the one that began executing again.
Yeah.
And my sense is that there was political benefit to his administration at that time for doing that. That's probably the best way to say it.
I think political benefit is a good way of saying that.
I'll
yes,
put it
exactly.
That's my understanding.
So some other statistics I got from the Tennessee website, it sounds like that the last execution happened almost a year ago in February of last year. And it seems like there's a geographical something or other going on, because 10 people sitting on death row are from East Tennessee, 9 are from Middle Tennessee, but 29 are from West Tennessee. What is that about? Can you speak to the geographical discrepancies?
Yes, I think Nick Sutton, who you referenced as our last execution, was February of 2020. So it was just he was executed just before COVID hit, because COVID is then what stopped the executions after Nick.
I see. Okay.
We had 4 more scheduled that year. So COVID has kind of stopped Tennessee's execution machine. So yes, I mean, the reality is that half of Tennessee's death row comes from Shelby County. It comes from one county, that's Memphis. There are lots of reasons, I'm sure, for that. Part of that is that you have had prosecutors in Memphis who have used the death penalty frequently, pursued it often, historically, whereas in other jurisdictions that is not the case. For example, here in Nashville, there is a pretty strict internal process for determining when the office seeks the death penalty. It's not done just anytime they can. Do you know what I mean? They've got their own sort of rubrics they look to, and it's fairly rare in Davidson County. In Memphis, it's much less than it used to be, like I said, because just across the board death sentences are down. But there was a time when they sought it in Memphis on a regular basis. So part of it is a culture of a district attorney's office, because they have the discretion to make that decision, which is why DA elections are very, very important. but also there is a racial and economic component to that cannot be denied, given the history of Shelby County, the history of lynching in Shelby County. It was one of the top 25 lynching counties in the country from the year 1880 to about 1950. That is not a coincidence that a county that was extremely high in lynching is a county that is also extremely high in death sentencing. It is, those connections are simply real, and we have to face them. And so it's really troubling. And the other piece to that, Anne, is, I don't think people think about this, but what that means is half of the row comes from Shelby. If you add Shelby, Davidson, Knox, and Hamilton, where Chattanooga is, so the 4 biggest urban areas, 70% of the row comes from that area. That means all the rural counties in Tennessee who are not utilizing the death penalty are paying for it and getting no benefit. There's no benefit to the death penalty in terms of public safety anyway, but those are dollars rural communities are pouring into the pot for cities to use this penalty that has no value in terms of public safety or help, preventing crime, right? And I don't think, and rural counties certainly aren't rolling in dough. You know what I mean? So like, people need to really think about that. And we want to help rural counties think about that, because that's money they could be using for other things.
So that was the other thing I got off of the Tennessee website, is that the state of Tennessee has executed 86 Black persons and 52 white persons. So the whole idea that the death penalty is fair, that seems to be just not true. And we've already talked about that, how there seems to be a racial discrimination, and there also seems to be a geographical difference. Yep. And what are some of the other differences that account for who gets the death penalty?
Yeah, and just to the race piece, while we're talking about it, I mean, you certainly have a disproportionate number of Black people, when only 17% of our population is Black, to have today half of our death row is, that's obviously an issue. But where you see race most glaringly within the death penalty system is race of the victim. If the victim is a white person, you are much more likely to get the death penalty, regardless of the defendant's race. And 75% of executions in this country in the modern era have been for white people, even though white people only make up half of all homicide victims. So you really see that. Then when you add race of defendant into the mix, and you have a Black defendant, a white victim, then you start seeing other sorts of shifting in terms of likelihood. But it's, and then we have issues around jury selection and who serves on juries, and qualified Black people being struck illegally off juries. This is another thing that we don't think about in terms of like the impact that kind of racial discrimination has, but it has a huge impact when you're talking about someone deciding whether this person's life is worthy of some sort of sentence that's less than death, worthy of redemption, if you will. But the other things that we see are, of course, economics, which pretty much across the board, if you, as the old saying goes, if you have the capital, you don't get the punishment. People who are poor are people who are on death row. That's just pretty much exclusive. They're generally people who could not hire their own defense, right? So they're given public defenders who are often great attorneys, but are overworked, underfunded, or appointed attorneys who may or may not have the skills or resources they need to do the work. This is the most complicated part of our justice system, is capital litigation, right? And you were talking about people who cannot afford to defend themselves. You also see mental illness as a huge problem. Clients with mental illness for lawyers are very difficult, and they don't know how to navigate the system. They often don't know how to participate in their own defense. They often are in denial about their illness. There's all sorts of things that go on with people with severe mental illness. You have people with intellectual disability. You have people with brain injury. You have people with horrific backgrounds of trauma and abuse, often who don't want to acknowledge it, whose families don't want to acknowledge it. And that's very important when you're putting on a death case, to explain to a jury why this person should not die, right? That's called mitigation. And if you don't know and you can't get the information as an attorney, we see that so many times, Anne, where someone goes to trial, there's not a lot of investigation, there's not a lot of looking into the person's history. They get the death sentence, they get a new set of lawyers who are only trained really to do capital work. They get in there and start doing that really hardcore work of going back and talking to every single person they can. And they discover all sorts of things, like the mental health of this person, like the abuse, like all these things that played into what happened and ultimately should have meant a sentence less than death, right?
Yeah.
So there are so many things that we know. Again, this goes back to where are we putting our energy and our resources. These are things we can list out. These are generally the factors that lead to death sentencing. It's not the crime facts necessarily. It's these other factors. But if we could invest our dollars in interventions for children, living in difficult situations, trauma-informed care, particularly for our children in communities that are disproportionately impacted by violence, mental health, creating many more services for people with mental illness, more hospital beds, more services for people living with intellectual disability. I mean, you just see how money spent and energy spent on that side of the equation is so much better and preventative than not spending that money because our budgets are, we don't have the money to spend, but we'll spend it once someone's offended, right?
Yeah, I'm absolutely a firm believer that you get way more bang for your buck in prevention than you do for intervention.
100%.
So on a whole lot of levels, we see that the death penalty just simply is not fair. And that happens on just a lot of different factors. But, as a family member, if somebody I loved was brutally murdered, my anger and my grief may be such that I would want to see the perpetrator of that crime get what they gave, I guess. And
yeah.
And so, I'm thinking, doesn't that provide some sense of closure or justice for family members to have the criminal executed?
It's a great question, and I think you're exactly right. I think all of us can understand, even though hopefully most of us won't ever be in that situation.
Exactly.
But where the outrage, the anger, the grief that is beyond words. I mean, these are all absolutely appropriate responses to a murder. I mean, to taking a human life, that is an egregious offense. And there has to be very serious accountability for that. What I see, and again, I cannot speak in any way, shape, or form for a victim's family member who's been through something like that. I can only sort of share what's been told to me from these families, many of whom are for the death penalty, many of whom are opposed to the death penalty. We sort of go into this sometimes believing all family members would support the death penalty if this happened to their loved one, and that's just not true. There is no one response, from someone who's lost a loved one. You have people, I've seen people who went into the process already, maybe from their religious faith, from their religious convictions, or simply just dignity of life convictions that they don't want death, or they don't think it honors their loved one. You I see folks who go into the process wanting it, and as time goes on, they change. As the person who is, has been charged, as they learn more, as they sit with it longer, they get to a point where they don't feel the need for that anymore. And then you have families who very much want it, and that is where they are. What I do find pretty much to be universally true is when you talk to these families, what they will tell you is the current system is damaging to them. That a death penalty system that takes 30 plus years, and very often, Anne, at least half of the time, ultimately ends in a different sentence than death. So, over the years, things come up, new evidence, procedural things that, that are problematic, and people will get their sentence reduced to life or life without parole, right? So you've got a 30-year process that in no way assures you that you're going to get a death sentence. And you are reliving that trauma the entire time. Whereas with other sentences, when you walk out of the courtroom, the day that trial is over, the sentence begins, right? The sentence is enacted. And yes, you may have parole hearings if that person gets life 20 or 30 years down the road. In Tennessee, it'll be 51 years down the road. We have a 51-year life sentence before you even have parole eligibility, right? And so we have very harsh alternative sentences, and that's a conversation for another day. But those folks walk out of the courtroom and the sentence has begun, and they can begin to do their best to heal and to move, right? For families that are trying to get the death penalty, where the prosecutor, it's only beginning. When that trial's over, it's only beginning. And it is so damaging, in my opinion. And when I think about, if we didn't have the death penalty on the table, we only had the alternatives or some alternatives, right? And all of that energy and all of that money was then being used for these families, right? To walk with them for as long as they needed in their healing process. Many of them financially, it's a huge financial cost to families if they lose, particularly if they lose a breadwinner to murder, all the costs that go with that. I mean, we don't think about all of those things that go, that families are dealing with. And what would that look like if, instead of just saying, oh, we're dangling out a sentence here that may or may not happen in 30 years, we say, let's have some finality and let's try to see what it is you need and how we can help you in that process. It's just the way it is done. And the reality is, Anne, people say, well, then why don't you just speed it up? It doesn't have, why is it 30 years? Why don't you speed it up? The reality is 30 years in, we still find out we've convicted innocent people. We still find out we've convicted people who have intellectual disability. Purvis Payne is a prime example here in Tennessee. 34 years, this man has lived on death row with an intellectual disability and very strong evidence of innocence. 34 years he's been in court. 34 years, nothing's different. Nothing's different about Purvis in terms of his intellectual disability or the evidence that was there showing he probably didn't commit the crime. And yet it was only because of COVID in 2020, he didn't get executed. And now he's off death row because a new law was passed that allowed him back into court to show the court, I have an intellectual disability and therefore it's unconstitutional to execute me. But for COVID, and for a lot of people working night and day to help get this law passed, that man could be executed in our state.
Yeah. Wow.
This is not a reliable system. And to say, oh, we just need to make it faster. Okay, if you do that though, I can promise you, you're going to be executing innocent people. And the real perpetrators are never going to be identified.
one of the things that you really helped me see is just how complicated the whole death penalty situation is. And I love the way you said that the death penalty is damaging to the victims' families. That's a real eye opener for me. But as tax dollars go, it seems to me it would supporting someone incarcerated for the entirety of their life sounds hugely expensive. Wouldn't it be cheaper to have them executed and out of the system? Talk to that.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, this seems like, this seems like, oh, of course, and that's generally people who haven't really looked at this very hard, and most of us don't really like to look at the death penalty or these awful acts of violence. It's not particularly enjoyable. And so we may not know as much. But that's where, TDP comes in, because we're trying to help people go beyond our reactions and really let's look at this thing as a policy. And the reality is, Anne, it costs millions more per case to maintain a death penalty system than a system that utilizes life or life without parole as the maximum punishment.
Wait a minute, millions
per
case? Does that mean like
per
person?
Per person. It's at least 2 million, and probably more in some instances per individual over the course of that litigation than had, for example, this is a mind-boggling number to me, and I think I'll get close if I don't get it exactly, but New Jersey from like 1983 to 2005, before they actually repealed their death penalty, but after looking at all this stuff, they spent $253 million from like 83 to 2005, 253 million more, okay, than they would have spent had they not had a death penalty, okay? So their death penalty system cost them $253 million more dollars than if they had just had life or life without parole, okay? They had 10 people on their death row during that time period. Tennessee, during a similar time frame, had 100 people on our death row. If New Jersey was spending $253 million over that time frame for 10 people, we had 10 times the number of people. That's the kind of dollars we're talking about. And that's huge. It's enormous amounts of money, and the state does not track it. There is no centralized mechanism to track the cost of the death penalty to taxpayers. And so we know that it has cost Tennesseans millions, if 253 million times 10, we're probably in the billions at that point. I don't know. But I mean, it has cost untold amounts of state dollars that we are not, again, and I'm a broken record, that we are not investing in support for victims of violent crime or other kind of crimes, for intervention in young people's lives who we see are in trouble, for mental health, behavioral health, drug treatment, for getting to our children, early childhood interventions and education. I mean, all of these things that we know keep us safer and keep our community healthier. We're spending all that on a system that is barely functional in terms of, numbers of people executed. I mean, if any other government policy that you looked at that was this ineffective and inefficient, we'd be like, this is insane. Why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Just from a dollars and cents perspective, never mind the moral layers and the fairness layer, all that, but it's really stunning, and thankfully, people on both sides of the aisle are really seeing it and are increasingly concerned, whether or not they have a moral problem with the death penalty or a lot of folks don't, right? But what they have a problem with is a policy that is supposed to benefit the state of Tennessee that has zero benefit. And in fact, I would argue damages does harm. And so that's where we're beginning to see more agreement from very different kinds of folks on maybe we don't need this. Maybe this is not something that we in Tennessee need to continue to rely on because it's just an abysmal failure as a policy.
But, I want to live in a world that is safe. I don't want to be worried about people who are going to harm me. And so I would think that having the death penalty would keep people in check. If they're thinking about committing a crime, they may think, oh, well, I shouldn't do this because if I kill someone, I in turn could be killed, and that would help keep the crime rate down low. So talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming research that's been done says that just isn't true. Now, other research says, you know what? The death penalty is such a small portion of penalties given out in this country. I mean, in my mind, it's far too many people, right? But when you're looking at the totality of homicides, I think it's something like 1/5 of 1% of all people who've committed homicide in this country since the 70s have been executed. 1/5 of 1%. So we're talking an infinitesimal number. So to be able to tie any deterrent impact to a number that low, right, is first of all very, very hard to do. So there's also a lot of research that just says, look, it's a wash. We don't know because it's so rarely used, and that it's just, we don't see any benefit to it at all. And what we see anecdotally, right, is states without the death penalty often have lower murder rates than states with the death penalty. States that have repealed the death penalty have actually seen their murder rates go down. Now, does that mean it's because they got rid of the death penalty? No, it's all these other factors we know, like we've been talking about again, the things that you're doing in your communities, people having access to jobs, all these things. Those are the things that really impact crime rates. The death penalty, there was a poll done, I don't know, 5-10 years ago of police officers around the country, where they see the death penalty in their toolkit, in terms of public safety. It was the very last thing, because most people who are in the criminal legal world understand that when people commit a murder, what is going to happen beyond that moment is not on their minds. And many of these murders particularly that end up on death row, as we've said, are people who are very ill, who are addicted, who may have, brain injury, who may have a horrible history of trauma. Rational cause and effect is not playing in the moment in which they act out, right? So this idea that people are out there contemplating the punishment, is just not very realistic.
Well, if the death penalty is so ineffective and so incredibly expensive, why do so many people seem to be in favor of it?
The good news is they're less in favor of it than they used to be. We're about, right now, polling, if you give people the option of death, or you give them other options like life sentence with restitution, life without parole, these other kinds of sentences, 60% of Americans will choose an alternative to the death penalty.
Oh, so a whole lot of people aren't really in favor of the death penalty.
If you just ask people, are you for the death penalty, right, you're going to get about 55% saying yes, because that's all you've asked them, right? But if you give them options that they can get in their head, okay, this means I like this, otherwise just giving them that question, you get a response like that. Giving them options, what we see is that more people, the majority, are going to pick a different option, so that's good news, and that's a real change, because in the 90s we were polling up in the 85% for the death penalty. Yeah, so it's a huge change, a huge drop. But I do think, to your point, Anne, about what is it, I think a lot of it is simply fear, outrage, anger, when someone commits a terrible act. And those are all natural, appropriate responses. Where I think what we have to do more of is education, is giving people the information about why the alternatives make more sense, why they can actually free up resources and time for things that are going to make the public safer, why they're better for victims' families ultimately, and how they can hold people accountable without risking the execution of an innocent person, or without risking the execution of someone who truly is not the most culpable of a crime as compared to other people. Again, we get back to the mental illness and the disabilities. And so when people have that information, I find that it really brings down the temperature, because they feel heard. I think part of it is when historically, the debate of whether it's right or wrong, whether it's moral or not, that's an important question. But I think the more important question for me is, does it work? And what are we giving up, right, that could actually benefit more of us by having it than if we didn't have it? You see what I'm saying? To me,
yes.
Many of us can agree on those things, right? We may not agree on, does the Bible approve of the death penalty or not, right? I mean, that's a very, Christians have different positions on that, right? And I know that very well. And it's an important question to talk about in certain contexts, of course. But when it comes to the policy, you don't have to agree on that piece of it, right? You don't have to agree to say the system we have isn't working. And if it's not, and we have alternatives that keep the public safe, that hold offenders accountable, that don't risk executing innocent people, that are less expensive, that give legal finality to murder victims' family members sooner, why do we hold on to the death penalty?
Well, you mentioned that sometimes it takes almost 30 years, and there's all these other stuff that's going on and all these legal wranglings and yada yada. It seems like if it takes 30 years to get to the execution point, that they would have gotten it right, and only those that are really guilty of the crime would be executed.
It seems that way. It's not. I have to laugh to keep from crying, everybody. So,
Sure.
no, I mean, again, I'll use Purvis Payne as a prime example. I mean, we're now, I'll go back to Purvis, but we're now up to 186 people across the country who have been exonerated from death row when evidence of their innocence was finally considered by the courts. That's since 1973, 186 people. That means that for every 8 executions that have happened in this country in that same period, we've had to let somebody go because we were wrong. And those are just the people we figured it out or allowed to have their innocence claims heard. It's almost certain, and there are cases out there that we are pretty much certain we executed innocent people. And that will continue to happen as long as you have a death penalty. Because again, Anne, going back to the beginning, if you are, charged with a capital crime without resources, with a mental health issue, with a history of trauma, not able to navigate the legal system very well, your defense, for whatever reason, doesn't do a lot of the work that needs to be done to give you the fairest trial possible, and you get that death sentence, you then are in this process. And what tends to happen is new lawyers come in, thankfully, who have much more expertise in capital litigation, and they begin to start over and go back and do a lot of work that should have been done prior to your trial. And what happens there? Okay, you find witnesses who were never talked to. You find evidence that was never turned over that the prosecutors didn't give you. You find DNA forensics that were never tested. You find all sorts of things that you may find a jury issue where all the Black jurors who were qualified to serve were taken off your jury. You find all these things, and so certainly those are not frivolous things. Those go to the heart of whether or not you were fairly tried, and frankly, whether or not you are even guilty. And that stuff has to be litigated. And, so this is why it can take so long. And for Purvis, as I said, this is a man who was 20 years old, a Black man in Shelby County. We've already talked about the history there. A man who had lived with intellectual disability, right? Whose ability to handle complex situations, complicated situations was not up to the way, those of us without an intellectual disability can navigate those situations. Finds himself in a situation where he is in a white woman's apartment after he hears crying from a neighboring apartment with 2 children stabbed brutally and a woman stabbed brutally, attempting to help her. And he now has blood on him. He's now touched the weapon, and the police show up. And a young Black male with an intellectual disability in Shelby County who hears police while he is standing there in 1987 with blood on his clothes, blood on his hands in the home of a white woman and her children, knows enough to know they're going to think I did it. And he runs. And they catch him, and that's all they needed to do. No other investigation, didn't look at alternative suspects. Purvis never changed his story, would not test him at the police station when his parents requested they do drug testing on Purvis, wouldn't do it. Then turned around and used he was high on drugs and wanted to have sex with a white woman as the motive at the trial. This is a young man who had never been in trouble, never been violent in any way, shape, or form, no arrest history, never been a drug user, grew up in a loving Christian family, father's a pastor. Nothing in that young man's background would ever in any way indicate he could do what happened in that room, right? And yet 34 years, Anne, he has been in this process. His mom has died, one of his sisters has died, all believing they were going to get him home every year for Christmas. His mama said, Purvis is coming home this year. His sister Rolanda and his daddy have been fighting all this time for somebody to please help them. And Kelly Henry, an incredible attorney, got involved a couple years ago and has just pushed this and pushed this. DNA testing was done. The most pertinent evidence the Shelby County DA had in their custody lost. And I'm doing air quotes right now. The piece of evidence, the fingernail scrapings under her nails that would have shown was that Purvis Payne's DNA under her nails? Because if it's not, that's the person she fought. Mm-hmm. That DNA is gone. That evidence is gone. And so, this has been going on and on and on. And the DA was forced to test that evidence. They didn't want to test any of the crime scene evidence. They were forced to do so in 2020. So it's just ridiculous that things that we know, tools we have, are resisted. Don't we want to know what happened? Don't we want to know if the right person is being held accountable? Doesn't the family of this young woman and the little girl who died deserve to know? And yet it becomes about maintaining the conviction you have and fighting to the death, pardon the pun, to maintain it. And so here we are 34 years later, and but for COVID and a new law that, again, took a whole lot of work to get passed, that man would get executed.
Wow.
I mean, that's 34 years, Ann.
Yeah.
34 years. He was 20 when that crime happened. He is 54 now, I think.
So you have done a great job of explaining how not only ineffective the death penalty is, but downright damaging it is, and also how crazy expensive it is, and that there are alternatives out there. And so if people wanted to get involved, what should they do?
Great question. I would encourage anybody who wants to get involved and learn more to visit our website, which is TennesseeDeathPenalty.org. And that's Tennessee is all spelled out, TennesseeDeathPenalty.org, and get on our mailing list. We don't overdo it, but we will send out emails periodically to update folks on what's happening both here and around the country, actions you can take, events that are happening, educational events, film showings, all sorts of things that are going on, that really can keep you in the loop to know, what do I need to do? Do I need to write a letter? Do I need to make a call? Do I need to send an email? Do I need to sign a petition? There's all sorts of stuff going on all the time. We also have a social media presence, TN Death Penalty, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And for those out there who are social media people, I know not everybody is, but if you are, it's super helpful to share those things, because that educates so many people, and that's how a lot of people get their news these days, right? So to do that, and just that, obviously people can donate to us as well, support us financially as we're trying to continue to educate and move this state to be like our neighbor state, Virginia, that just last year ended their death penalty. We've got Ohio and Utah right now, led by Republicans in those states, moving repeal legislation, trying to end it in Utah and Ohio, and they're viable bills. We don't know if they'll get it done this year, but they could. So there's just lots going on right now, and it's we're seeing movement. We're seeing real movement, but we have to get as many Tennesseans as possible engaged, because when our lawmakers understand that Tennesseans just don't believe that this is helpful to us and we don't need it, they'll be able to act. As long as they think that Tennesseans want this, it's going to be a much heavier lift. But when they start hearing from their people, when they start seeing things in the newspapers and reading things on Twitter and understanding that things are changing, our understanding of how to do criminal justice is changing and is different than it once was, and that we all need to get on board that train, right? Once they understand that, then we're going to see a lot more movement. And so that's why we just need every Tennessean that has an interest in this to join us, get on that website, sign up, let us know who you are, and then you can be as active as you want or not, but that's at least going to give you the opportunity.
Well, this has just been such an informative conversation, Stacy. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ann. It's been great.